Back in 2011, I was a young, nerdy comic book fanboy. One of my favorite comics was Green Lantern. Back then, I read a lot of Showcase Presents Green Lantern volumes, archiving the earliest adventures of Green Lantern Hal Jordan. The early John Broome, Gil Kane stories focused a lot on Hal, essentially a superhero that had a magical ring, only limited by his imagination, fighting random supervillains such as Star Sapphire, Hector Hammond, the Aerialist, and other throwaway villains. But he also had his arch-nemesis Sinestro. These were essentially just your average superhero stories, the shit you might see Superman fight. As a kid, I loved these easy-to-consume popcorn stories, and I also loved generic Gary Stu protagonist Hal Jordan. I even loved his racially insensitive sidekick Pieface. Soon, I was a huge Green Lantern fan, even beginning to enjoy the Jeff Johns run. The run where Hal and his other Green Lantern friends would get in all sorts of space battles with other colored lanterns, the ultimate mirror villains. But soon, like all mirror villains, they started getting old. They started getting really old. But luckily for a young 14-year-old me, that wouldn't matter for much longer, because Hollywood icon Ryan Reynolds was going to set it all right by fighting Hector Hammond on the big screen. Maybe the comics would also allow Green Lantern to fight villains like Hector, rather than just recycling the "my ring is better than yours" plot over and over again. So young, naive me went to the midnight premiere of Green Lantern, and well, the movie was somehow more terrible than the comics it was being based on. Sure, Jeff Johns' writing was played out and drier than saltine crackers, but saltine crackers can taste alright sometimes, especially when paired with a nice chowder. The Green Lantern movie is so fundamentally flawed, no amount of chowder could make it taste good. Now, I won't lie, at 14 I put on my fanboy goggles and enjoyed the film, but 14-year-old me had such shit taste that I probably would have enjoyed Batman v Superman, or worse, Suicide Squad. I think this clip of me from 2011, soon after the release of this movie, proves my point.
Wow, it's a great movie.
However, my palate has matured. I like much better movies now, like Freddy Got Fingered or Spider-Man 3.
There's water in the tap.
If I had to guess why this movie was made, I would guess it had to do with Marvel's fairly recent success on Iron Man. Iron Man was a B-list hero whose popularity exploded because of his movie, both on the page and on the screen. His film created the modern cinematic universe, and this film was released the same year as both Captain America the First Avenger as well as Thor. While the cinematic universe potential had yet to be proven, that wouldn't really happen until Avengers. Iron Man had proven that these B-list heroes could be as big as Spider-Man or Batman. This movie was meant to make Green Lantern the next big star, the next Iron Man. And leading up to this film, a young me was sure that would happen. You gotta imagine how excited, pathetic, socially awkward me was to brag to everybody that I knew about this great comic book character before everybody else. But unlike Iron Man, this movie bombed, and I started looking like a massive retard in all my Green Lantern gear. I was a laughingstock, and my self-esteem never recovered. It is probably the reason I'm still a virgin. Anyway, clearly the folks at Warner Brothers wanted to capitalize on Iron Man. You see, Green Lantern really is DC's Iron Man. He shoots lasers, flies around, generally has some presence in DC's Avengers, so it is no wonder Hal's arc is pretty comparable to Tony Stark's. He starts out a douchey, overly confident asshole, then he becomes a good guy. The difference is Iron Man learns to be a good guy through his experience as a former hostage of the Taliban. His initial arc of being a good guy happens when he sees the carnage his weapons have caused. This is a turning point in his character. Then he learns to be more responsible when he is a superhero. Hal is just kind of a douche and becomes less of a douche when he becomes a hero. But we really have no turning point in this film, where he realizes he was a douche. In fact, the fact that he's a douche is the only reason Carol quit dating him, but once he has superpowers, she starts dating him again for presumably that sole reason. So as an audience, we're now supposed to assume that he just isn't a douche anymore. Essentially, his arc is just a far shittier version of Iron Man's. Fact of the matter is, we don't even see why he's a douche as much as Iron Man. Iron Man acts like an asshole, fucks random chicks, and makes his fortune off being a weapons dealer. All we see from Hal is that he comes to work late, tells a girl he just had sex with that there's water in the tap, and crashes an expensive jet. I suppose you could argue his arc is more about responsibility, but even that is never fully resolved because he's never shown to be that irresponsible. The closest thing we have to resolving this is the film showing that he has the courage to fight Parallax, but we know from the start of the movie when he crashes his jet that he has courage. So essentially, even though it's implied Hal changes, he really doesn't. The core reason this movie failed to be a good response to Iron Man is because the character of Hal does not change like Tony, making him feel very flat.
There's water in the tap.
Comically bad acting aside, Hector Hammond might still be the worst villain in the history of film. While this movie was smart not to blow its fat $200 million load on a Lantern War Film 1, the film still majorly dropped the ball on the villain of the film, Hector Hammond. Hector is what the media fears incels are. He is a Pokemon Sapphire, World of Warcraft playing virgin, high school teacher, and a general loser. But lucky for Hector, his father is able to hook him up with a sweet job doing alien autopsies, despite the fact he is clearly A, willing to mention the alien autopsy in an attempt to get pussy, and B, is an underqualified high school teacher. Even though his dad hooked him up with this sweet job he is very unqualified for, he is still ass mad and wants to kill him for it. His motivations in this film make no sense. He wants two things: to kill his dad for helping him with his career, and he wants to fuck Carol. The two things that make him a villain is that he hates his dad for helping his career, and hates Hal for being a Chad. The core issue with his character is that he's underestablished. He kinda just shows up, we see he's a loser, then he grows a testicle head, kills his dad, and then turns into a CGI Halloween skeleton. I really don't feel bad for him. I don't understand why he's mad, except maybe at Hal, but the film does a shit job of showing this. Essentially, what we have, bottom line, is a glorified school shooter that is not only a bland villain, but a shitty one with virtually no motivation to actually be evil. The film should have established him in the flight scene with the drones. We know from later in the film that he apparently knows Carol and Hal, so maybe he is there as a friend or to tell his senator dad about some shit. Then have Hal be a douche to him when he's trying to talk to him. This would enhance three lackluster aspects of the film. First, we would know he knows Hal and Carol. Second, it would further Hal's character arc as it would further cement him as a douchebag. And third, it would give Hector actual motivation to hate Hal. See, this is one of the main problems with Hector as a main villain. While he's a good first villain for the franchise, they just came up with a whole bunch of ideas for him which all came off as half-baked. Hector is not threatening, he has no motivation, he is just an insecure manlet, like me.
There's water in the tap.
Speaking of half-baked, this film feels like it tried to have some sort of theme about fathers and legacy, but never does anything with it. The main three characters in this film are Hal, Carol, and Hector, all who feel they're living in the shadow of their fathers. Hal's dad was also a courageous pilot who inspired him to fly. This likely was the reason he had the courage to become the Green Lantern. The problem with this is that all we really get in reference to this is when his brother tells him he wants to live and die like his father, and when we see his dad die in a comedically bad death scene. It is never really mentioned outside of this. Carol's dad is the owner of Ferris Aircraft, that's about it, and Hector feels he lives in the shadow of his dad, who seemingly tries to help his pathetic manlet son, yet still we are supposed to be led to believe his generosity makes him an asshole. Here is the problem with this, and why it is half-baked. Hal never has a point in the film where the courage his dad gave him helps him succeed or helps him face his fears. Perhaps he could have mentioned the courage his father gave him to the Guardians rather than just saying some bogus Optimus Prime speech at them. This would have shown the reason he wants to save the Earth, as that is what his dad would have done. Now this isn't to say the Optimus Prime speech wouldn't have sufficed, but since the theme was in the movie, why not actually do something with it? Hector's father would have been the perfect antithesis to Hal's dad. Make him verbally call Hector a failure, make him cower from difficult situations, and most importantly, make him a fucking asshole. This would have caused two different things. First, it would make us, as an audience, dislike him, making us better understand Hector's motivations, and two, it would show that he's a weak man who puts himself in front of others. Instead, what we get is a man who selflessly wants to help his son, who is then killed because his son is mad that he is slightly disappointed with him. If I wanted to kill my dad for being disappointed in me, then he'd already be dead. But that's not a valid reason for me to kill my dad, so no one would feel sorry for me. The same goes for Hector.
There's water in the tap.
The origin is probably the best part of this film, and that's not saying much. A big problem with superhero movies are their tendency to lean on telling an overly long origin story. This was a problem in the early 2010s especially. Famously, The Amazing Spider-Man was roasted for being an overly long origin. Now, this film is not as guilty as Amazing Spider-Man, as for the majority of audience members, this would be their first exposure to Green Lantern, where many audience members have seen Spider-Man's origin 10 years earlier in the first Spider-Man film. The problem is the origin is overly long in this film, which is a big reason Hector and Parallax didn't have enough screen time to become strong villains. Ryan Reynolds' more recent superhero franchise Deadpool did a better job at this by starting the film as Deadpool, then filling in the blanks through flashbacks periodically. Deadpool is an origin movie, but how the story is structured, it doesn't feel like one. This movie is an origin film and feels like it, even making Hector pretty attached to Hal's origin, a la Green Lantern and Spider-Man. The action we get before the third act is scarce. All we get is boring, riskless training scenes with Kilowog and Sinestro. The first time we actually get to see Hal fight a villain is when we see Hal fight Hector for the first time, which is followed 10 minutes later with him fighting Hector again for the last time. It makes the movie really fucking boring, which is not a problem a $200 million action movie should have. Again, comparing this to the original Spider-Man, we at least got a sprinkle of action throughout, like when he fights Macho Man Randy Savage, also when he fights Green Goblin at the parade, and the weird scene where Green Goblin in full Power Ranger garb dresses in drag in a burning building. Green Lantern needed a few scenes like this. It would have caused the film to be far less stale and boring.
There's, water in the tap.
There are very few redeeming factors to this mess of a movie, but I do want to go over one of the things that are actually really good. Mark Strong makes a perfect Sinestro and actually captures the villain's essence pretty well. Honestly, if they made a second or third film with him as the villain and had a better writing staff to put together a better movie, I actually could see Sinestro being a pretty cool villain. I suppose the one thing I really disliked about Sinestro is him jumping the gun on getting the yellow ring. Sure, he says it's more powerful and shit, so they need it to fight Parallax, but being that the yellow ring is powered by fear and Parallax is the living embodiment of fear, it seems to me, by the logic presented, it would not be the most effective tactic in fighting Parallax. Perhaps they could have had the Manhunters or some other villain or villains attack the core in the next movie, leading to Sinestro creating the yellow ring, and then show how powerful it is, and then in a potential third Green Lantern movie, have Sinestro break bad and become the villain.
There's, water in the tap.
Now seems like a good enough time to talk about Parallax. Parallax has no dialogue and a thin motivation, thus is not a character, which makes him a pretty horrible main villain. The movie falls into the same trap as Spider-Man 3. It has too many villains, and this movie only has 2. You see, Spider-Man 3, at least the villains have things called motivations. Despite how ham-fisted they might seem, at least we get why characters in that film do what they do. Sandman robs people to afford his daughter's surgery, and while yes, it makes kind of no sense how he acts at the start of the film, especially because of the complete 180 he takes in the last 2 minutes of the film, at least we get why he does what he does. Harry Osborn wants to kill Spider-Man for killing his dad, and Venom is disgraced and humiliated by Peter Parker, making him want to kill Spider-Man.
I come before you today, humbled and humiliated, to ask you for one thing. I want you to kill Peter Parker.
Parallax is a fucking boring villain, as all he wants to do is destroy the Earth because he's an evil fear cloud. It really makes no sense and is scarcely explained. In the comics, Parallax is an entity that needs a host. That's why, in the comics, he had taken over Hal in an attempt to corrupt him, and he did for a time. Now this could have been a pretty cool concept, since I doubt the movies would have ever tackled a full-blown movie on Parallax's possession. Maybe he takes over Hal, and Hal uses his ultimate willpower to free his soul or some crap. Instead, what we got is a massive cloud monster. I really don't see how the writers, directors, and producers thought, oh yeah, this will work, that's a great idea. Especially since Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer did this exact same concept 4 years earlier with Galactus, and that movie bombed critically, with many critics, especially ones familiar with the source material, specifically citing Galactus as a major reason it sucked. Clearly, taking a character and horribly misinterpreting it as some sort of cloud monster that wants to eat Earth is a fucking stupid idea. But even beyond his boring, characterless character, he's also not threatening. Case in point, there is a scene where, Hal is about to get killed by Parallax, but then Parallax gets shot by like 2 missiles. This not only phases him, but causes him to flee rather than killing the one guy that can feasibly stand in his way. Okay, so why do you even need a Green Lantern? Just carpet bomb the fucking guy until he dies or flees. It makes him look like a major pussy for a guy who could destroy the world, I guess. Also, I don't really understand how Hal tells the Guardians something around the lines of humans succeed because we're scared. Okay, I get it's a speech meant to make the fanboy's spine tingle, but if we look back just a few scenes, they send like 10 Green Lanterns to fight Parallax, all who die because they're scared. That is Parallax's fucking superpower, killing people who are afraid, but that doesn't work on Hal? I guess because he's a Gary Stu.
There's water in the tap.
Hal Jordan is a Gary Stu cut and dry. From the start of the film, we see he's the best pilot who has ever lived, everybody loves him except Carol, and even that doesn't last too long as she starts liking him just for being a superhero. But personal relationships aside, Hal is seemingly never in danger of anything. And I'm not just referring to a personal harm. At one point in this film, a few disgruntled people attempt to beat up Hal for getting them fired, and smacks them with a giant green fist, even hitting one guy so hard he breaks through a brick wall. Now Hal must be pretty lucky that there were no witnesses, because I am willing to bet that all of those people died. First, how did these people who clearly hate him not out him as Green Lantern? Second, how can a human body survive breaking a brick wall? He would have broken long before that wall. You see, this is a huge leap of logic. I get that it was a scene meant to demonstrate the ring's power to both Hal and the audience, but Hal literally kills 4 people horribly and no one mentions it. Hal doesn't feel bad, it makes no fucking sense, and the scene is retarded. Anyway, I think the most blatant reason Hal deserves the Gary Stu title really has to do with him beating Parallax. As alluded to earlier, Hal could beat Parallax apparently because he is a scared human when like 20 Green Lanterns just pulled up and died automatically. But maybe, just maybe, with enough training, if he was a veteran Green Lantern, they could have said some bullshit like he had such focused will that it worked. But this film shows him train for like an hour, and Sinestro even says of the Lanterns that died on that mission before the mission, a team of our finest Lanterns. This is, in my opinion, more of a stretch of logic than when Ray was able to beat Kylo Ren. Compared to Hal, Ray put in the work. Now, I know most superheroes are Gary Stu's, but at least when Batman does the impossible, shit, we know he at least trained. Hal is just the best at everything he does, surely because he's the main character. His few flaws are mental flaws that he apparently overcomes in his story arc, but it's a story arc they say happens that in reality never fucking happens on film. It's really too bad too. Ryan Reynolds did a good job for what he was given, and I think he's a perfect choice for Hal. But too bad the people who wrote this movie have no idea how to write a character with flaws and challenges.
There's water in the tap.
So far in this review, I neglected to mention the elephant in the room, and that is the literal terrible CGI. Look, I think the character designs in this film look good enough, like Tom Array, Sinestro, and the Guardians. The problem is, when tossed on all CG backgrounds, it looks, well, pretty terrible. I think the CG would have been more tolerable, especially on the Oa scenes if it wasn't all CG. For example, the training scene. I genuinely can't find anything that's not CG except for Ryan's face, and it makes it look horrible. I mean, look at the MCU. Most of those films combine CG with makeup art and some level of practical effects, and it makes it look pretty good. A great example of this is the Iron Man suit in Iron Man 1. It was partially practical, mainly in the chest plate and mask, and part CG, and it looked pretty good. In fact, I would argue the Iron Man 1 suit looked better than the Infinity War suit, mainly because the overuse of CG in that film. So when you look at Ryan's full CG suit, it just looks fucking horrible, especially since the suit could have looked pretty good for around the same budget. The final and most blatantly terrible CG is the CG stunt work. Look at this scene where Abin Sur falls into the spaceship. It looks horrible and the character model looks horribly off, and it takes me out of the film as it doesn't even look close to real. CG is a great tool for filmmakers to do things that can't be done in real life. And yes, I don't think a Green Lantern film could be done without CG, but this should be a cautionary tale for how CG can ruin a film more than it helps it.
There's water in the tap.
Green Lantern is a film full of huge fundamental flaws, as I've stated before, but there are a lot of small details I want to complain about as well. One scene that really bothers me is when Abin's spaceship crashes. After Hal gets the ring from Abin, him and Pieface flee the scene as 2 helicopters come into plain sight. These helicopters are from a top secret military operation that apparently does alien autopsies. So why didn't they even attempt to capture the guys in the Jeep who were just seen fleeing the scene? They burned the fuck out and there's no way that helicopter didn't see them. You're telling me they outran 2 military helicopters? At least give us a chase scene where they get away Fast and the Furious style. God knows this boring ass movie needed it. I know earlier I said Ryan Reynolds did a pretty good job for what he was given, and I stand by that, but the dialogue between him and Pieface is pretty ridiculous at times, especially at the after-mentioned fleeing the helicopter scene. Most of the comic relief falls flat, like when he tries to figure out the oath. That scene can only be described as cringy.
To infinity and beyond. By the power of Grayskull. What the hell?
You know what scene I really hate? That one where Hal makes a Hot Wheels track to save the Senator. Like, out of fucking anything in the world you could have created, they chose a fucking Hot Wheels track? It's pretty fucking stupid, especially since the sequence probably costed like $8 million to make. One problem most superhero movies have is their generic ass scores, and this film is no exception. In the last 10 years, only 2 superhero films have had memorable scores, The Dark Knight and The Avengers. At this point, mentioning this feels like overkill, but it seems like an important part of filmmaking these movies really drop the ball on. The Avengers' final fight against Loki and the Chitauri is far more epic when this booming, catchy score plays. It evokes an emotion of heroism and has us leaving the theater humming the theme. It is just as important as any set piece or CGI monster, yet it is rare that a film actually gets this crucial piece of filmmaking right. I really can't shit on Green Lantern too much for this, as sadly it's basically the norm, but it honestly would have enhanced the final fight greatly to have some epic music booming to distract us from the plot of the film.
There's water in the tap.
When it comes down to it, Green Lantern feels like a superhero film that was whipped together to make a buck with a rush script that was not well thought out, written by people who do not actually give a shit about the character they are writing. It has an overabundance of CGI, it's boring, but its ultimate flaw was that it seems like a film no one wanted. Warner Brothers clearly just wanted to make their own Iron Man, but with no clear idea of how they wanted to execute it. Iron Man sets up Iron Man, it touches on the cinematic universe idea after the credits, but honestly, Iron Man could have came out, flopped, and never had a sequel, just like this film, and it would still be a solid, well put together superhero film. This film wanted to set up a franchise and forgot to be a good film in and of itself. That's why the filmmakers saw no problem with the prolonged origin and weak antagonists, because they figured at the time the practically guaranteed sequels would make up for it. As a result, this film is a sad, unwatchable, franchise-baiting piece of shit. Not a watchable film. I genuinely believe even children wouldn't sit through this movie. If I was a kid, I would rather see Batman fight the Joker than Green Lantern fight Testicle Head. This movie is garbage, and I think it sucks.